May 18th, 1980, Washington State, United States. A quiet Sunday morning in the Pacific Northwest. Forests stretch for miles, lakes sit undisturbed, and above it all stands Mount St. Helens, a mountain long considered dormant, predictable, stable. But beneath the surface, pressure has been building for weeks and for months. And on this morning, it will finally be released. Global catastrophes like this are not born in a single moment. They are built. Let's rewind the clock and revisit events as we count down to disaster. March of 1980. After more than a century of silence, something began to stir beneath Mount St. Helens. A mountain long considered dormant, predictable, and safe by those who lived and worked in its shadow. At first, the signs were subtle, almost easy to ignore, as a series of small earthquakes rippled quietly beneath the surface. Too faint for most people to notice, but impossible for scientific instruments to dismiss. Seismographs began tracing a pattern that suggested movement deep underground. And for the first time in generations, attention turned back to the mountain. Within days, those faint signals began to intensify, and what had once been background noise became something far more deliberate, far more concerning.
We received a notification very early on, right after March 20th, when the first earthquake began. And that was the beginning of the most hectic, 10, 12 months of my life, I guess. We watched very closely as the earthquake swarm escalated in March.
March 27th, 1980.
At noon was the first, or about noon was the first pop.
Steam burst violently from the summit, carrying ash high into the air and marking the first visible eruption in over 100 years. It was not catastrophic, not yet, but it was enough to confirm what scientists had already begun to suspect. Mount St. Helens was waking up. As researchers arrived and set up monitoring stations around the volcano, they quickly realized that this was not an isolated event, but the beginning of a process. The earthquakes continued, the ground shifted, and beneath the surface, pressure was steadily building, forcing magma upward through the Earth's crust and reshaping the mountain from within.
My first impression, in other words, was one of not quite chaos, but certainly an unmanaged situation where we were just reacting to what the volcano was doing rather than knowing exactly what was going on.
As April unfolded, the activity surrounding Mount St. Helens became impossible to ignore.
It was just 20 hours a day of questions, try to explain things to people. Reporters came in swarms.
As small eruptions sent ash clouds into the sky, and the summit itself began to change shape. A crater formed where none had existed before, and each new explosion served as a reminder that the mountain was no longer stable. But the most alarming transformation was not at the summit, but along the mountain's northern flank, where a massive bulge began to emerge, slowly pushing outward as magma accumulated beneath it.
What was essentially happening at Mount St. Helens was that magma or molten material was moving up from some deep reservoir beneath the mountain up into the volcano itself. And what basically happened is that this viscous magma moved up into the volcano, and it began to grow or form what we call a dome or a cryptodome inside the volcano. And that inflating body of magma or molten material actually broke the north side of the volcano and began to cause the north side of the volcano to expand out toward the north.
At first, it appeared insignificant, a slight distortion in the mountain's profile, but day by day, it grew larger. To the scientists studying it, this bulge was more than a physical change. It was a warning sign of immense pressure building beneath the surface, with nowhere to go. The mountain was effectively swelling, its internal forces straining against the rock that contained them. And the longer that pressure remained trapped, the more dangerous the eventual release would become.
Because this is such a symmetrical volcano and because the crater is so high, if there's an explosion, it's probable that the debris, the very hot incandescent ash that would come down, could come down all sides. But right now, there's a very great hazard due to the fact that the glacier is breaking up on this side of the volcano, on the north side, and that could produce a very large avalanche hazard.
Measurements were taken constantly. Data was analyzed around the clock. And yet, despite the growing sense of urgency, one crucial question remained unanswered. When would it finally give way?
By the time I got here, the bulge was obvious, and we were measuring the rate of northward movement of the bulge at about 6 feet a day, and we knew that wasn't so good. I guess it was frightening to be on the volcano. We had some pretty strong discussions about whether or not we should be in the volcano, around the volcano, etc., for personal safety reasons. And the other side taking, well, we got to get the science while it's available.
As the situation escalated, authorities moved to establish a restricted zone around Mount St. Helens, limiting access in an effort to protect nearby communities and prevent unnecessary risk. Residents were evacuated, roads were closed, and the area surrounding the volcano was placed under careful watch. And yet, the response was not absolute. Some residents resisted evacuation orders, unwilling to abandon their homes, while others were permitted to return during daylight hours.
As far as we know, it's just a joke. Well, not really a joke, I guess, but it could last 100 years. We're going to stay till the rocks start falling, I guess.
You don't mind working in the shadow of the mountain, then?
No, not at all. There's nothing to be scared of. More danger from one of them trees falling on the backside than there is a mountain exploding.
Logging operations, vital to the local economy, continued in nearby areas, and a sense of uncertainty lingered over every decision that was made.
Oh, I'm like that old captain. By God, I'm going down the ship. I said, if the damn thing takes this mountain, I'm going along with it. I'd rather be dead than to live without it.
Scientists, including volcanologist David A. Johnston, monitored the mountain closely, fully aware that the signs pointed toward a major eruption, even if the exact timing and scale remained impossible to predict. He observed the bulge, tracked the seismic activity, and understood the implications of what was unfolding. Yet, like everyone else, he was left waiting for a moment that could not be precisely defined.
Dave Johnston had been able to make a measurement with using the range master that he had, Coldwater 2, and found that there'd been no change in rate of movement, actually a slight decrease in rate of movement, since the last time the measurement had been made some time before.
As days turned into weeks, the visible activity began to slow, and for some, this created the illusion that the danger was beginning to pass. Explosions became less frequent, ash clouds less dramatic, and the mountain appeared, at least on the surface, to be settling down. But beneath that surface, the pressure had not diminished. It had only continued to build. By early May, the behavior of Mount St. Helens had entered a quieter phase, one that made it increasingly difficult for the public to reconcile the warnings with what they could actually see. The dramatic eruptions of previous weeks had subsided, and while seismic activity continued, it no longer commanded the same level of attention. Restrictions began to ease in certain areas, and with them came a gradual return of curiosity. As visitors ventured closer to observe the volcano that had dominated headlines just weeks before, for many, the absence of a major eruption created a sense of reassurance, a belief that perhaps the worst had already passed. Scientists, however, remained cautious because the bulge on the mountain's north face had not disappeared. In fact, it had grown even larger, becoming a clear sign of structural instability that could not be ignored. The mountain was no longer simply active. It was deformed, weakened, and under immense internal strain. The question was no longer whether an eruption would occur, but what form it would take when it finally did. On the morning of May 18, 1980, the landscape around Mount St. Helens appeared calm, almost deceptively so, as clear skies stretched across the region and the mountains stood in silence. At observation posts positioned miles away, scientists continued their watch, including David A. Johnston, who monitored seismic readings and waited for any sign of change. Below, in the surrounding areas, people carried on with their day, some working, some observing, and some simply existing within a landscape that had not yet revealed what it was about to become. There was no visible countdown, no dramatic signal that the moment was approaching, only the quiet accumulation of forces beneath the surface, building toward a breaking point that had been weeks in the making. At 8:32 that morning, a magnitude 5.1 earthquake struck beneath Mount St. Helens, triggering a chain reaction that would unfold in seconds, but had been building for weeks. The already weakened north face of the mountain collapsed in a massive landslide, the largest in recorded history, as millions of tons of rock and debris cascaded downward, suddenly releasing the pressure that had been trapped beneath the surface. What followed was immediate and catastrophic.
You had to see it to believe it, to get that total impression.
I had seen a number of the small steam explosions that had been occurring for the 2 months prior to May 18, but I had never seen anything on this magnitude, and I knew that it was a huge eruption compared to what we'd seen so far.
As a lateral blast erupted from the side of the mountain, sending superheated gas, ash, and debris surging outward at incredible speed, flattening everything in its path and reshaping the landscape in an instant. Forests that had stood for centuries were erased within seconds, reduced to splintered remains by a force that moved faster than sound.
This avalanche came down the North Fork Toutle and just pushed all the trees in the valley out of the valley down at the head of this avalanche. So at the front end of the avalanche was this big giant pile of trees and fence posts and bushes and shrubs that had been just scraped off the valley floor and were all down at the end of the avalanche.
There were places north of the volcano which was left pristine. There was old growth in there, just huge, huge trees, and you could walk in there and not hear a sound because of the vegetation mat. It was just a gorgeous, wonderful wilderness there. And to know that in your mind, actually having seen it 4 days beforehand, and come back and see it all gone, that was quite a shock. It took me about 2 weeks of flying across the boundary of the blast zone before I stopped having that physical, emotional hit.
From his observation post, David Johnston radioed his final message before the transmission was cut off, swallowed by the eruption itself. Vancouver, Vancouver, this is it.
Up in there was a chunk of the debris avalanche, a landslide I was calling it. That was pretty amazing because you have to, for it to get there, what it meant is the landslide came down off the volcano, across the plain, went right through where Truman's Lodge was, into the lake, and they must have ridden the floor of the lake bottom all the way and come up on the other side. And there it was, a big deposit of it up on that upper end of the lake. It's huge hummocks of daysite and basalt and stuff that come off the top of Mount St. Helens. Behind some of the hummocks, that is on the side away from the lake, there were gigantic log jams, huge things, almost as high as the hummock. That's a record of that water having been thrown up there and rushing back with this huge flood into the lake again and making these gigantic log jams.
Later, I wondered if Harry Truman had maybe painted himself into a corner by being so firmly saying, "I'm never going to leave." So even if he had at some time become convinced that it was too dangerous, because it didn't take an eruption to wipe out Harry, just a landslide failure of that expanding bulge would have taken him out, I think.
In the aftermath, the scale of the destruction was almost impossible to comprehend, as 57 people lost their lives, and hundreds of square miles of forest were flattened, buried, or burned beyond recognition. The shape of Mount St. Helens was permanently altered, its summit reduced, and its northern face gone, leaving behind a landscape that bore little resemblance to what had existed before. And yet, what makes this disaster so striking is not just the power of the eruption, but the fact that it was not sudden or without warning. The earthquakes, the steam eruptions, the growing bulge, all of these were signals, part of a process that had been unfolding in plain sight.
Obviously, for volcanologists in the United States, the Mount St. Helens eruption was a spectacular learning opportunity.
We learned a lot about how you interact with the civil defense, with the public, with the press, and that was transferred by the press to the world. And as a result, I think volcanology took a quantum leap in science as well as applicability to society's needs. And I think it was probably the most important eruption in the history of volcanology.
I think all of us were a little numbed by having lost Dave Johnston. I knew two other people who were killed in the eruption as well. And so we were both more wary of the crater than we might otherwise have been. And also, speaking for myself, I was also motivated by those deaths to try to do better than I was doing before, to down the road try to save lives that to kind of make up for the loss. So I think we were both cautious and moved to do better as a result of what had happened on the 18th.
So it turned out that the 8 years that Mount St. Helens was erupting in the early 1980s was an opportunity, an unprecedented opportunity for USGS scientists to study hot, fresh, young, and exciting deposits from explosive volcanism. And we basically, we learned incredibly new and important bits of information about how volcanoes like Mount St. Helens work, what kinds of deposits are produced during these explosive eruptions, and how to anticipate and mitigate the consequences of explosions.
This was not a single moment, but a countdown. A gradual buildup of pressure that, once it reached its limit, could no longer be contained. When forces like this are set in motion, there comes a point where nothing can stop them. And once that point is reached, there is no turning back.